7 reasons scientists think we are overdue for a mass extinction and haven't told you. The last time something this big happened, 3/4 of all species on Earth vanished. Not gradually, not in slow motion over millions of quiet years. In geological terms, it was nearly instantaneous. The oceans acidified, the skies darkened, the food chains that had taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble collapsed like a table with its legs kicked out. And then it was over. The world that came after looked almost nothing like the world that came before. That was 66 million years ago, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the one that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. Here is what most people believe about mass extinctions. They are ancient history. Catastrophic, yes. Fascinating, yes. But safely in the past, separated from us by geological time, so vast it may as well be fiction. They're the kind of thing that happens to ammonites and trilobites and 3-horned giants that once walked across what is now Montana. Not to the civilization that discovered penicillin and built the James Webb Space Telescope. Not to us. That belief is wrong. Not in a hand-waving, technically everything could happen way. Wrong in the precise, documented, peer-reviewed way that keeps certain researchers awake at certain hours of the night. Wrong in the way that matters. There are 7 distinct scientific lines of evidence that suggest the Earth is either already in the early stages of a 6th mass extinction or approaching the threshold conditions that have historically preceded one. These lines of evidence come from different disciplines. They're measured by different methods, using different data, maintained by different research teams on different continents, with different funding sources and different professional incentives. They converge on the same conclusion. And the scientific community, for reasons we will examine carefully and honestly tonight, has not communicated this convergence with anything close to the clarity it deserves. By the end of this video, you will understand each of those 7 reasons in full. You will understand what a mass extinction actually is, by the strict geological definition, not the popular one. You will understand why the signals that precede one are so difficult to read in real time. You will understand the architecture of scientific communication that creates the gap between what researchers know and what reaches public awareness. And you will understand why that gap, that specific gap between the data and the public understanding of it, matters more than almost anything else currently happening on Earth. If you enjoy videos that take the hardest questions in science and follow them precisely, without flinching, wherever the evidence leads, I would genuinely appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, settle in, get yourself nice and comfortable. Let's begin. Before we get to the 7 reasons, we need to establish what a mass extinction actually is. Because the popular understanding of the term is imprecise in a way that distorts everything that follows. In casual usage, mass extinction means something like a lot of species died, a catastrophe, a bad time for life on Earth. This is not wrong, but it is not sufficient. It does not give you the diagnostic threshold you need to recognize one while it is occurring, which is exactly the problem we face. The scientific definition is more precise, and every word in it is doing work. A mass extinction is a period in which the global rate of species loss exceeds the background extinction rate by a statistically significant margin, across multiple taxonomic groups simultaneously, over a geologically brief interval, resulting in the permanent loss of at least 75% of all species alive at the time. Let us unpack that definition piece by piece, because the pieces matter. Background extinction rate is the baseline speed at which species naturally go extinct in the absence of any major disruption. Species have finite lifespans, just as individual organisms do. They arise through speciation, they persist, they disappear when they can no longer maintain viable populations in their environments. The average lifespan of a mammalian species is roughly 1 million years. For marine invertebrates, whose fossil record is more complete and whose diversity is better documented, it is closer to 10 million. Across all life forms with reasonable fossil representation, the background rate is estimated at somewhere between 0.1 and 1 species extinctions per million species per year. Paleontologists write this as E/MSY, extinctions per million species years. It is the metabolic rate of the biosphere, the resting heartbeat of planetary life when nothing catastrophic is happening. The 75% threshold comes directly from the fossil record. Paleontologists Antoni Barnowski, Nicholas Matsky, Suzunu Tomiya, and their collaborators, writing in Nature in 2011, identified 5 clear moments in the last 540 million years when species loss exceeded 75% of all life on Earth within a geologically brief window. Brief, in this context, means less than 2 million years, often far less. These are the 5 confirmed mass extinctions. The end or division, approximately 443 million years ago. The late Devonian, around 375 million years ago. The end Permian, 252 million years ago, the worst of all, which killed an estimated 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. The end Triassic, 201 million years ago. And the end Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, the one that ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs and that most people visualize when they hear the phrase mass extinction. What triggers these events? The causes vary, and the variety is instructive. The end Cretaceous extinction was triggered by the Chicxulub impactor, an asteroid approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter that struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico with an energy release equivalent to roughly 10 billion Hiroshima bombs detonated simultaneously. The immediate consequences included megaton-scale wildfires across multiple continents, a years-long impact winter caused by sunlight-blocking debris and soot filling the stratosphere, the collapse of photosynthesis-dependent food chains from the bottom up, and ocean acidification from the sulfur-rich evaporites vaporized at the impact site. The end Permian, by contrast, was almost certainly triggered primarily by the Siberian Traps volcanic event, one of the largest sustained volcanic episodes in Earth's history, which released enough carbon dioxide and methane to raise global temperatures by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius over tens of thousands of years, while simultaneously acidifying the oceans and producing acid rain that stripped nutrients from terrestrial soils. The mechanisms are different. The result is structurally the same. In both cases, biosphere crosses a threshold beyond which its internal buffering mechanisms cannot self-correct, and a cascade begins. What matters for tonight's discussion is not the specific triggering mechanisms of past extinctions. It is the pattern of conditions that precede them, because those conditions have fingerprints. Measurable, quantifiable fingerprints that show up in the geological record consistently across multiple independent systems before the threshold is crossed. and 7 of those fingerprints are currently present on Earth in the living world around us right now. The first reason scientists think we are overdue is the rate of species loss we are already measuring today in the present tense with modern instruments and rigorous methodology. In 2015, Barnowski and a team of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published a paper in Science Advances titled Accelerating Modern Human-Induced Species Losses, Entering the 6th Mass Extinction. The title is not a provocation or a rhetorical choice. It is the finding. The paper compared current vertebrate extinction rate against 2 benchmarks simultaneously: the fossil record background rate and the rates observed and inferred during the 5 confirmed mass extinctions. The results were direct. The current rate of vertebrate species loss is between 24 and 114 times higher than the background extinction rate, depending on which conservative assumptions you apply to the calculation. 24 times on the most cautious estimate the team could construct, 114 times on the raw numbers without methodological correction for conservatism. To calibrate what that means, if vertebrate species were going extinct at the background rate, we would expect to lose roughly 9 vertebrate species per century. Over the last century, we have documented the extinction of approximately 477 vertebrate species. Not 9, 477. A rate elevated by a factor between 53 and 114 above the baseline that prevailed for millions of years before the industrial era. Barnowski's team was careful to note that even at the absolute lower bound of their estimate, the current extinction rate is severe enough that, if sustained at its current pace, it will reach the 75% threshold that defines a geological mass extinction within 240 to 540 human lifetimes. That sounds like a comfortable buffer until you realize 2 things. First, the current rate is not steady. It is accelerating, driven by the ongoing expansion of human land use, the continued burning of fossil fuels, and the spreading of invasive species through global trade networks. Second, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, the one we think of as instantaneous, the one caused by an asteroid impact and a global firestorm, unfolded over a period of roughly 30,000 years in geological time. That 240 to 540 lifetime window is not an eternity. It is the same order of magnitude as the fastest extinction event in the previous geological record. But here is where the story becomes considerably more complicated and considerably more serious. The 477 vertebrate species figure counts only confirmed extinctions. Species that have been formally declared extinct by the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List criteria, which requires thorough field surveys across the species' known historical range. Multiple years of failed detection by qualified researchers and formal peer-reviewed documentation of the extinction. This is a conservative number by institutional design. The IUCN process, rigorous as it is, lags reality by years and sometimes decades, because the resources required to conduct formal extinction assessments are not available for every species at the rate species are disappearing. The 477 number does not count the thousands of species classified as critically endangered, which the IUCN defines as facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the near future. It does not count the tens of thousands of species whose populations have declined by 90% or more, losing nearly all their geographic range, without yet crossing the formal extinction threshold. And it covers only vertebrates, which represent a small fraction of total species diversity on Earth. Gerardo Ceballos at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and Paul Ehrlich at Stanford University have been tracking what they call biological annihilation, the collapse of animal populations, even among species that have not yet formally gone extinct. In a 2017 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they analysed population trend data on 27,600 vertebrate species, roughly half of all known vertebrate species on Earth. They found that nearly 1/3 of those species had experienced significant population declines in recent decades, with populations losing 30% or more of their geographic range. For 177 species of mammals for which they had detailed historical range data extending back to 1900, all 177 had lost more than 30% of their geographic range over the 20th century. More than 40% had lost more than 80%. Ceballos named this biological annihilation because the loss of populations, even within species that still technically exist somewhere on Earth, represents a collapse of the ecological functions those populations perform. A species reduced to a remnant population in a single small habitat patch is not, ecologically speaking, performing the same work in the biosphere as the same species distributed across its full historical range. Pollination routes collapse. Seed dispersal patterns change. Predator-prey dynamics that have been in equilibrium for thousands of generations shift. Nutrient cycling breaks down at landscape scale. The species is alive on paper. The ecosystem function it provided is already gone. This distinction between formal extinction and functional extinction is one of the most important concepts in contemporary extinction science, and it is one of the least communicated publicly. A grizzly bear population confined to small fragmented habitat patches in the northern Rockies is not performing the same salmon carcass transport, the same seed dispersing, the same prey population regulation that it performed when it ranged from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains. The species exists, the ecological role it played across that vast territory does not. The first reason, then, is not just that we are losing species faster than the background rate. It is that we are losing populations, geographic ranges, and ecological functions at a rate that exceeds even what the species loss numbers suggest. The biosphere is more depleted than the formal extinction counts indicate, and the formal counts are already alarming. The second reason brings us to the group of organisms that most people overlook entirely, and that may matter more to the stability of the biosphere than any other group alive. Insects. For most of the history of extinction science, insects were largely excluded from the analysis. They are extraordinarily difficult to count systematically. Historical records of insect abundance are sparse and geographically patchy, and they are not emotionally compelling to the funders, policymakers, and media organisations that determine which ecological crises receive attention. A disappearing Bengal tiger generates headlines around the world. A disappearing solitary bee species generates a brief notice in a specialist journal. The disproportion in attention is enormous. The disproportion in ecological significance runs in the opposite direction. In 2017, the Krefeld Entomological Society in Germany published what became one of the most widely discussed ecological papers of the decade. The Society had been running standardized insect traps at 63 nature reserve sites across Germany since 1989, collecting and weighing trapped insects over the same periods each year. Their analysis, published in PLOS One by Hallman and colleagues, found a 76% decline in total flying insect biomass at those sites over 27 years. 76% over 27 years. At nature reserves, which are by definition among the most protected and least disturbed terrestrial habitats in Germany, not in agricultural fields, not in urban areas, in protected areas specifically designated for wildlife conservation. The methodological response from the scientific community was thorough. Researchers pointed out that the Krefeld study covered only one region of Central Europe, that the nature reserve studied was surrounded by intensive agricultural land that could affect insect populations even inside protected boundaries, and that 27 years, while substantial for a human-scale study, is relatively short for detecting long-term ecological trends. All of these criticisms are legitimate. None of them explained away the 76% figure. 2 years later, in 2019, Francisco Sanchez Bayo at the University of Sydney and Chris Wykiwise at the University of Queensland published a broader meta-analysis in Biological Conservation, reviewing 73 historical reports of insect population trends from around the world. Their synthesis found that more than 40% of insect species are declining globally. A third of all insect species meet IUCN criteria for threatened status. The total biomass of insects on Earth is declining at approximately 2.5% per year. 2.5% per year sounds almost manageable. It does not feel catastrophic in the way that a 76% regional decline does. But compounded over time, 2.5% annual decline means a 25% reduction in total insect biomass over a decade, a 50% reduction over 28 years, functional elimination of most insect biomass within a human lifetime. The compound mathematics of small annual losses applied to long time horizons is one of the most systematically misunderstood dynamics in ecological thinking. And it is one of the reasons insect decline has not generated the level of public alarm that its trajectory warrants. The Sanchez Bayo paper received significant methodological criticism. A subsequent review by David Wagner at the University of Connecticut, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2021, argued for a more nuanced picture. Certain insect groups are declining severely. Others are stable or even increasing in abundance. Some generalist species, those capable of exploiting a wide range of habitats and food sources, are doing well. It is the specialists, the species with narrow habitat requirements, specific host plants, or precise climate tolerances that are declining fastest. This distinction between generalists and specialists is, if anything, more alarming than a uniform decline would be. Specialist species are disproportionately the ones that perform the irreplaceable ecological functions. Specialist pollinators have evolved alongside specific plant species over millions of years, developing physical structures, behavioral patterns, and timing that maximize their effectiveness as pollinators for those specific plants. When specialist pollinators disappear, they are not replaced by generalists. The function degrades, the plant's reproduction suffers, the animals that depend on that plant's fruit and seeds suffer. The cascade proceeds. Approximately 87% of all flowering plant species on Earth depend on animal pollinators, the vast majority of them insects, according to a 2011 analysis by Jeff Ollerton and colleagues published in Ocos. Without their pollinators, those plants do not reproduce. Without those plants, the animals that eat their fruit, seeds, leaves and flowers decline. Without those animals, the predators that depend on them decline. Without those predators, prey populations destabilize. The collapse of insect diversity is not a story about insects. It is a story about the load-bearing walls of terrestrial food webs going into structural failure, floor by floor, from the bottom up. The second reason is distinct from the first in a critical way. The vertebrate extinction data shows you the sixth mass extinction may have begun. The insect data shows you the mechanism by which it would propagate through the biosphere is already active and already measurable. The third reason brings us to the ocean, and to a phenomenon that has been embedded in climate discussions for 30 years, while its specific implications for extinction risk have been consistently under-communicated. Ocean acidification. The chemistry is not complicated, but it is regularly misrepresented in ways that make the problem seem less serious than it is, which is why we need to work through it with precision. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it does not simply sit there inertly. It reacts with water molecules to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid partially dissociates into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. It is the increase in hydrogen ion concentration that constitutes acidification in the chemical sense. Ocean surface pH has dropped from approximately 8.2 before the industrial era to approximately 8.1 today, a tenth of a pH unit. In most contexts, a number that small would barely register, but pH is a logarithmic scale. A decrease of 0.1 pH units does not represent a 0.1% increase in acidity. It represents a 26% increase in hydrogen ion concentration. The oceans are 26% more acidic in chemical terms than they were before the Industrial Revolution, since roughly 185.0 in 170 years. The projected change by 2100 on current emissions trajectories is an additional 0.3 to 0.4 pH units drop below current levels, meaning 0.4 to 0.5 units below pre-industrial baseline. A 0.4 unit decrease from pre-industrial pH would represent a roughly 150% increase in hydrogen ion concentration relative to where the oceans were when the steam engine was invented. For comparison, ocean pH has not been at that level since the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum approximately 56 million years ago, an event associated with significant marine extinction and disruption of ocean food webs that took hundreds of thousands of years to stabilize. But the PTM acidification, rapid by geological standards, is estimated to have unfolded over roughly 20,000 years. The current acidification has achieved roughly a third of the PTM's total magnitude in under 200 years. The rate of change is approximately 100 times faster than the fastest comparable event in the geological record. This speed is not a secondary detail. It is, in many ways, the central fact. Ocean organisms have evolved over millions of years to function within a narrow pH range. The enzymes governing their metabolic processes, the calcium carbonate structures they build for shells and skeletons, the sensory systems they use to navigate, find food, and avoid predators, all of these were optimized by natural selection for a chemical environment that is now changing faster than evolutionary adaptation can track. The organisms most immediately affected are the calcifiers, the oysters, mussels, clams, sea urchins, starfish, and the vast diversity of corals and pteropods that form the structural and nutritional base of enormous reaches of the marine food web. These organisms build their hard structures from calcium carbonate, and the saturation state of calcium carbonate in seawater is directly reduced as pH falls. Below a certain saturation threshold, shells and skeletons begin dissolving faster than they can be built. This is not a projection, it is a currently occurring, directly observable process. A 2012 study by Nina Bednarsek and colleagues, published in Nature Geoscience, examined the shells of pteropods collected from the Southern Ocean and found that the shells were already dissolving at the ocean surface. Pteropods are tiny free-swimming sea snails, sometimes called sea butterflies, that are typically between 2 and 10 millimeters in length, and that exist in densities of hundreds per cubic meter of water in productive ocean regions. They're a critical food source for salmon, herring, mackerel, and several species of whales throughout the North Pacific and Antarctic oceans. A study found severe dissolution damage on pteropod shells collected from areas where the erogite saturation state, a specific form of calcium carbonate pteropods use, had dropped below the threshold required for shell stability. This is the chain that makes acidification a mass extinction risk multiplier, rather than merely a marine chemistry problem. Pteropod shells dissolving means pteropod populations under stress. Pteropod populations under stress means reduced food availability for the fish that depend on them. Reduced food for those fish means population declines in those fish. Population declines in those fish propagate upward through the food chain to the marine mammals and seabirds that eat them, and the loss of those apex consumers alters the dynamics of every trophic level below them. Coral reefs add a separate and equally significant dimension to the acidification story. Reef-building corals construct their calcium carbonate skeletons in collaboration with symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae, which live within the coral's tissues and provide much of the coral's energy through photosynthesis. When ocean temperatures rise beyond the coral's thermal tolerance, even temporarily, the coral expels its zooxanthellae in what is called coral bleaching. A bleached coral is not dead, but it is severely stressed and vulnerable. If temperatures return to normal quickly enough, corals can reabsorb zooxanthellae and recover. If the thermal stress persists, the coral dies. Acidification compounds bleaching stress by reducing the calcification rate at which corals can rebuild their skeletons after thermal bleaching events, making recovery progressively slower. The 2016 and 2017 bleaching events on Australia's Great Barrier Reef, the worst in recorded history, killed approximately 50% of corals across the northern section of the reef. If it was not rebound in one, surveys conducted in 2020 documented another mass bleaching event, the third in 5 years. Corals require roughly a decade to recover from severe bleaching under favourable conditions. 3 severe bleaching events in 5 years under conditions that include ongoing acidification do not provide recovery intervals. They provide a ratchet. each event starting from a lower baseline than the last. The Great Barrier Reef contains approximately 1,500 species of fish, 4,000 species of mollusks, 240 species of birds, and supports fisheries that provide food and income to millions of people across the Indo-Pacific. A world without functional coral reef ecosystems is not a world without some ocean scenery. It is a world with a fundamentally different and impoverished marine food system, with cascading consequences for food security across some of the most densely populated coastal regions on Earth. The fourth reason requires us to turn our attention inland, to a category of ecosystem that most people think of as a backdrop to other conversations, rather than a central character in the extinction story. Freshwater. Freshwater ecosystems, which include rivers, lakes, wetlands, ponds, streams, and the underground aquifers that connect them, cover less than 1% of Earth's surface. They contain approximately 10% of all known animal species, including roughly 40% of all known fish species, and an even higher proportion of known amphibian species. Gram for gram, square meter for square meter, freshwater ecosystems are among the most species-dense environments on the planet, and they are collapsing faster than any other major ecosystem type on Earth by a wide margin. The Living Planet Index, produced jointly by the World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London, and updated every 2 years, tracks population trends for thousands of vertebrate species across terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems. The 2020 report, drawing on data covering the period from 1970 to 2016, documented an average population decline of 84% for monitored freshwater vertebrate species over that 46-year period. Not 84% of species lost, 84% average decline in population size among monitored species. The average freshwater vertebrate population being tracked in 2016 was 16% of the size it had been in 1970. 46 years. Less than 2 human generations. To calibrate that decline, if you had been tracking a population of river dolphins that numbered 1,000 individuals in 1970, the 2016 equivalent would be 160 individuals. For a migratory fish species that numbered 500,000 individuals in 1970, the equivalent would be 80,000. Across the breadth of freshwater vertebrate life, that is the average trajectory. The drivers are multiple, and they interact with each other in ways that make them worse in combination than individually. Dam construction has fragmented river systems across every inhabited continent, blocking the migratory routes of fish species that evolved over millions of years to travel hundreds of kilometers between feeding grounds and spawning grounds. American eel, the Atlantic and Pacific salmon, the European sturgeon, the Chinese paddlefish, these are species whose life histories were calibrated to entire river systems treated as connected wholes. When dams divide those systems into isolated segments, they do not merely inconvenience the fish. They break the biological logic that makes the species viable. Agricultural water extraction draws from rivers and aquifers at rates that exceed natural replenishment across enormous regions of the world. The Colorado River, which once flowed with sufficient force to have carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, now fails to reach the sea for much of the year. Its delta in Mexico, once one of the richest wetland ecosystems in North America, supporting hundreds of species of migratory birds and a rich community of fish and vertebrates, has been reduced to a largely dry salt flat. The water that once filled that delta now irrigates crops in Arizona and California and supplies cities across the American Southwest. Agricultural runoff introduces nitrogen and phosphorus into water systems at rates far exceeding natural loads, triggering algal blooms that consume oxygen as they decay and create hypoxic dead zones where fish and invertebrates cannot survive. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, fed by nutrients draining from the Mississippi River watershed, which encompasses approximately 40% of the continental United States, covers an area of roughly 22,000 square kilometers in peak summer months. That is an area roughly the size of New Jersey, devoid of the oxygen that marine life requires, persisting through the warmest months of every year when fish reproduction and growth are most critical. What makes freshwater collapse particularly relevant to mass extinction risk is not only the direct loss of freshwater species, enormous as that loss is, it is the indicator function that freshwater systems serve in the broader ecological picture. Rivers and lakes integrate the condition of entire landscapes. They receive the chemical and biological consequences of what happens to soils, forests, urban areas, and agricultural land across their entire watersheds. A collapsing freshwater ecosystem is a signal that the terrestrial systems draining into it are under stress that is not yet fully visible in broader metrics. The freshwater systems are going first precisely because they are the drainage points, the places where all the indirect effects of land use, climate change, pollution, and water extraction accumulate and concentrate. Their rapid collapse is a warning about the state of the landscapes around them. The fifth reason is the one that generates the most scientific debate, the most public controversy, and the most political heat. It is also the one that connects most directly to the question of whether the extinction crisis we are already in could transition from a slow process to a catastrophic one. It is the question of climate tipping points. The concept of a tipping point in climate science comes from the study of complex dynamical systems, specifically systems that have multiple stable states separated by unstable thresholds. The canonical analogy is a rocking chair. Tilted slightly, it returns to equilibrium. Tilted past a certain angle, it tips, and once it tips, no small corrective force will prevent it from completing the fall. The transition between stable states is not proportional to the force applied. It is threshold dependent. In the climate system, the most extensively studied tipping element is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. This is the system of ocean currents that includes the Gulf Stream, and that functions as a giant heat transport conveyor, drawing warm tropical surface water northward into the North Atlantic and European seas, releasing that heat to the atmosphere, then returning as cold, dense, salty, deep water southward. AMOC is a primary reason that London and Paris have far milder winters than their latitudes would otherwise produce. Reykjavik, which sits at roughly 64 degrees north, the same latitude as central Alaska, has ice-free harbours through most winters because AMOC pumps warmth toward it. AMOC has two stable states. A strong mode, which has prevailed through most of the Holocene, the geological epoch of the last 11,700 years that encompasses the entirety of human civilization. And a weak or collapsed mode, which prevailed during glacial periods when large flights of lasers seized the excesses and seized the sound-like fires which prevailed during glacial periods when large flights of lasers is solid and glorious. The transition between these states is not gradual. It is threshold dependent, meaning AMOC can weaken slowly for a long time and then transition rapidly to the collapsed state once a threshold is crossed. In 2021, a study by Nicholas Bors at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, published in Nature Climate Change, analysed 8 decades of observational data on sea surface temperatures and salinities in the North Atlantic that serve as proxies for AMOC strength. Using a statistical technique called critical slowing down analysis, which measures a system's ability to recover from small perturbations and decreases as a tipping point approaches, Bors found clear evidence of declining AMOC stability over the observational record. The system was exhibiting the mathematical signatures of a system approaching a state transition. His paper was careful not to specify a timing. It did not say AMOC would collapse by a specific date. It said that the stability characteristics of AMOC had changed in the direction consistent with approaching a tipping point, which is a qualitatively different and more alarming statement than saying AMOC is weakening. A 2022 paper by Peter and Susanne Dittelvissen at the University of Copenhagen, published in Nature Communications, applied a more specific statistical technique to longer sea surface temperature proxy records extending back to the 1870s, and suggested a potential AMOC tipping point somewhere between 2025 and 2095, with a central estimate around 26057. This paper received vigorous methodological criticism from Stefan Rahmstorff at the Potsdam Institute and other leading AMOC researchers, who argued that the proxy used was not a sufficiently direct measure of AMOC strength, and that the statistical methodology had not been validated for this specific application. When Stefan studied the paper, the debate is ongoing, and the Dittelvissen timing estimate should not be treated as established science. What it should be treated as is a serious scientific hypothesis that the oceanographic community is actively evaluating. What is not debated is the consequence of AMOC collapse if it occurred. Climate model simulations of AMOC collapse across multiple modelling centres consistently show rapid cooling of 5 to 15 degrees Celsius over northwestern Europe within decades of collapse onset. Simultaneous warming along the US East Coast and in subtropical Atlantic regions, severe disruption of the West African and Indian monsoon systems that currently supply rainfall to the agricultural systems feeding billions of people, and significant sea level rise along the North American Atlantic coast as the water pile-up effect maintained by AMOC is lost. These are not marginal effects. They are civilization-scale disruptions to the food and water systems of some of the most heavily populated regions on Earth. AMOC is one of 9 major tipping elements identified in the landmark 2018 paper in Nature by Timothy Lenton, Johan Rockström, Owen Gaffney and colleagues. The others include the Greenland ice sheet, which contains enough water to raise global sea levels by approximately 7 meters if it fully melted, the West Antarctic ice sheet, which contains another 3 to 5 meters of sea level equivalent, and shows evidence of basal melt acceleration, driven by warming ocean water penetrating beneath it. Tropical coral reef systems, which we have already discussed. The Amazon rainforest. which research by Thomas Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre, published in Science Advances in 2018, suggests could transition from a net carbon sink to a net carbon source if deforestation crosses approximately 20 to 25% of the basin's original forest cover and the permafrost across Siberia, Canada, and Alaska, which stores an estimated 1.5 trillion tons of organic carbon accumulated over thousands of years, and which releases that carbon as carbon dioxide and methane as it thaws. The 2018 Lenton paper's critical finding was not that any one of these tipping elements is imminently at risk, though several are closer to their thresholds than was understood a decade ago. The critical finding was that these tipping elements are not independent, they interact. The crossing of one tipping point adds incremental warming, changes precipitation patterns, or disrupts carbon cycling in ways that push other tipping elements closer to their own thresholds. Greenland ice melt adds fresh water to the North Atlantic, weakening AMOC. Weakened AMOC changes heat distribution in ways that affect Amazon rainfall. Amazon forest loss changes regional atmospheric moisture circulation. Each crossed threshold increases the probability of others being crossed, in a cascade that the authors described as a potential hothouse Earth. Trajectory: self-reinforcing warming that continues regardless of subsequent human emissions reductions, driven by the interacting tipping cascades themselves. The authors were explicit that the evidence for this cascade scenario is not conclusive. It is a risk assessment, not a projection. But the magnitude of the potential consequences, combined with the credibility of the mechanisms involved, places it firmly within the category of extinction-relevant risks that deserve serious public understanding. The sixth reason requires going back to the geological record and asking a question that paleontologists have been wrestling with for 4 decades without reaching consensus. Are mass extinctions periodic? Do they happen on a schedule, driven by astronomical or geophysical cycles, independent of what life on Earth is doing? In 1984, paleontologists David Roop and J.D. John Sepkoski Jr. at the University of Chicago published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that analysed extinction rates in marine fossils across 250 million years of Earth history. Their database covered 3,300 families of marine invertebrates. Their analysis identified a roughly 26 million year periodicity in extinction intensity, a statistically significant tendency for extinction rates to cluster at intervals of approximately that length. Not every 26 million years exactly, with perfect regularity, but a clustering that exceeded what random distribution of extinction events across time would produce. The paper was immediately and vigorously contested. Statisticians argued about the methods used to identify periodicity in an irregular time series. Paleontologists argued about the dating of geological boundaries and whether the fossil record was sufficiently complete to detect a real 26 million year signal against the noise of imperfect preservation. The debate was sharp, and it has never been fully resolved. But the observation has not been disproven either. It has been refined. Michael Rampino at New York University has returned to this question more than a dozen times over 4 decades. His most recent major paper on the subject, published in Historical Biology in 2020, reanalyzed extinction data using the most current and complete marine fossil databases available, including the Paleobiology database, which contains millions of individual fossil occurrence records, and applied updated radiometric dating for geological boundaries. His analysis found a statistically significant periodicity in mass extinction events of approximately 27.5 million years. close to, but not identical to the Rao-Persepkoffy figure, the difference arising from improved dating of geological boundaries. For the physical mechanism, Rampino proposed the periodic passage of the solar system through the midplane of the Milky Way galaxy. The solar system does not orbit the galactic center in a flat plane. It oscillates, bobbing above and below the galactic disk, with a period estimated at roughly 26 to 30 million years per full oscillation. As the solar system crosses the dense midplane of the galaxy, it encounters elevated densities of molecular clouds, increased cosmic ray flux, and potentially higher densities of dark matter. Any of these could, through different physical mechanisms, destabilize the Oort cloud of comets at the outer edge of the solar system, increasing the rate at which comets are deflected into the inner solar system. More comets in the inner solar system means statistically higher impact rates on Earth. Rampino is explicit that the dark matter component of this mechanism is speculative, more so than the molecular cloud and cosmic ray components. He presents it as a plausible candidate mechanism that deserves investigation, not as an established fact. But the periodicity observation, separated from the question of mechanism, has survived multiple rounds of critical scrutiny across 4 decades. It appears to be real. The reason this matters for tonight's discussion is not the implication that we are approaching a periodic extinction pulse. On the 27.5 million year cycle, simple arithmetic places the next periodic pulse somewhere between 11 and 16 million years in the future, depending on when exactly you count the last major event and which estimate of the period you use. We are not imminently due in that astronomical sense. What the periodicity research matters for is the methodological byproduct. In the process of identifying and measuring these periodic pulses, paleontologists have built detailed records of the typical lead time between the first measurable signs of biological stress in the fossil record and the crossing of the mass extinction threshold. Well, that lead time across the 5 confirmed events has ranged from roughly 10,000 years at the fastest end for bolide-triggered Cretaceous extinction to approximately 2 million years for the more gradual Ordovician and Devonian events. Even the fastest, the Cretaceous, show signs of marine ecosystem stress in the record for hundreds of thousands of years before the asteroid impact delivered the coup de grace. We are already, right now, inside what would constitute the warning interval for a mass extinction in geological terms. Not because an asteroid is approaching, not because of a periodic astronomical cycle, because the biosphere is exhibiting multiple measurable stress indicators simultaneously across independent systems in patterns that in the geological record have preceded mass extinction crossings. We are not 66 million years past the last event and waiting for the next trigger. We are a biological civilization that has, in roughly 300 years of industrial activity, produced several of the most diagnostic precursor conditions that show up in the fossil record before mass extinction thresholds are crossed. The biosphere is not waiting for a cosmic trigger, it is generating its own. The seventh reason is the one discussed least in public scientific communication. It is the hardest to quantify with simple metrics, and it may in some ways be the most revealing of how the extinction crisis actually works. It is the collapse of functional diversity. Species richness, the raw count of how many species exist at any given time, is the metric that dominates extinction discussions in public and in much scientific communication. It is intuitive, it is countable, and it connects directly to the 75% threshold that defines a geological mass extinction. But species richness alone is an incomplete measure of biological health, for a reason that takes a bit of time to understand properly, and that is worth understanding precisely. Functional diversity refers to the variety of ecological roles or functions being performed by the species in an ecosystem. Pollination, seed dispersal through animal guts, soil aeration by burrowing invertebrates, nutrient cycling by decomposers, apex predation that controls herbivore populations, nitrogen fixation by root bacteria, grazing that prevents grassland from converting to shrubland, and dozens of other processes that together maintain the physical and chemical conditions that allow the ecosystem to persist. An ecosystem in which many species perform the same few functions has low functional diversity. An ecosystem in which each species contributes a distinct function or combination of functions has high functional diversity. The difference matters enormously for resilience. In a high functional diversity ecosystem, the loss of a single species rarely removes an entire function, because other species can partially compensate. In a low functional diversity ecosystem, the loss of a single functionally unique species can remove a critical process from the system entirely, with no backup available. This is ecological redundancy, and it is the biosphere's primary mechanism for absorbing species loss without cascading collapse. What is happening globally is not simply species loss. It is the selective loss of functionally important species at rates disproportionate to their numerical abundance. Large predators, megafauna, specialist species, migratory species with large home ranges, and species with narrow habitat requirements are being lost faster than generalists and smaller-bodied species. This pattern is not coincidental. It reflects the nature of the primary extinction drivers. Habitat loss preferentially eliminates species with large territory requirements. Overharvesting concentrates on large-bodied species. Invasive species preferentially outcompete specialists that evolved in isolation without broad-spectrum competitors. Climate disruption preferentially eliminates species with narrow thermal tolerance ranges. The result is that the species disappearing fastest are disproportionately the ones performing the functions that other species cannot replicate. Rodolfo Dirzo at Stanford University and colleagues published a paper in Science in 2014 titled "The Defaunation in the Anthropocene" that documented the ecological consequences of large animal population declines across multiple ecosystem types. The paper used the term defaunation, the loss of animals from ecosystems, without necessarily crossing formal extinction thresholds, to capture the functional impoverishment that occurs through population collapse and range contraction, even among species that technically still exist. The documented cascades were dramatic and specific. The loss of large mammalian browsers from African savannas through hunting and habitat loss changed vegetation structure at landscape scale, reducing canopy cover in ways that altered fire regimes, which altered insect communities, which altered bird populations, which altered seed dispersal patterns for dozens of plant species. The removal of wolves from Yellowstone National Park in the early 20th century allowed elk populations to expand and overgraze riparian vegetation along stream banks, which destabilized stream banks, which changed stream hydrology, which reduced beaver populations, which reduced wetland area, which affected dozens of amphibian, bird, and fish species. When wolves were reintroduced beginning in 1995, researchers documented a trophic cascade in reverse, the so-called ecology of fear, in which elk avoided riparian areas where wolf predation risk was high, allowing streamside vegetation to recover and stream hydrology to begin restoring itself. The functional diversity research tells you something about mass extinctions that the species richness data alone does not. It tells you that biospheric collapse does not happen suddenly at the moment the 75% threshold is crossed. It happens progressively through the accumulation of functional losses that each individually seem manageable, but collectively reduce the system's capacity to absorb the next disruption. Each lost function makes the ecosystem more brittle. Each brittle ecosystem requires less disturbance to collapse further. The cascade accelerates over time, not because any single additional loss is catastrophic in itself, but because the losses accumulate against a declining baseline of resilience. This is the architecture of a mass extinction. Not a single event, a process, a ratchet. And it means that by the time the process is recognizable as such, in real time, measured against the scale of human attention spans and human institutional memory, it is already far advanced. Now we need to address the question that is implicit in the title of this video. Why haven't scientists told you? This framing requires precision because it is easy to misunderstand what is being claimed. Many scientists have told you. Anthony Barnosky, Gerardo Ceballos, Paul Ehrlich, Rodolfo Dierzo, Timothy Lenton, and dozens of their collaborators have published findings in the highest profile scientific journals available, have given public lectures, have written accessible books, have spoken to governments and international bodies. The data is not hidden. The papers are publicly accessible. The conclusions are stated clearly in the abstracts. The gap is not between the data and the scientists. The gap is between the scientific communication system and the level of public understanding that the urgency of the findings requires. And that gap has identifiable structural causes. The first cause is the architecture of peer-reviewed science itself. Scientific papers are evaluated on methodological rigor. The culture of scientific publishing, which has evolved over centuries to protect against overconfident claims and premature conclusions, strongly incentivizes epistemic caution. Acknowledge uncertainty, qualify conclusions. Hedge where the data permits alternative interpretations. This culture is valuable. It is what makes scientific findings reliable over time, but it creates a consistent mismatch between what the data shows and how it is communicated. A paper that says the current rate of species loss is consistent with the early stages of a mass extinction will clear peer review. A paper that says we are in a mass extinction will face much harder scrutiny because the word "are" implies a certainty about where we are on the trajectory that the data, strictly speaking, does not fully support before the 75% threshold is actually crossed. The result is that even findings of dramatic urgency emerge into public consciousness, dressed in qualifications that dilute their impact without improving their accuracy in any meaningful sense. The hedging is epistemically appropriate It is also in the context of public understanding of extinction risk, genuinely costly. The second cause is the disciplinary fragmentation of science. The 7 reasons we have discussed tonight come from paleontology, entomology, marine chemistry, freshwater ecology, climate science, galactic astrophysics, and functional ecology. Each of these fields maintains its own specialist journals, attends its own conferences, trains its researchers in its own methodological traditions, and largely communicates with other fields only at the margins. 1. Each E. The researchers who understand the insect decline data deeply are not, in most cases, deeply embedded in the literature on tipping point dynamics in the climate system. The researchers who study functional diversity collapse are not, in most cases, closely tracking the galactic periodicity literature. The synthesis, the recognition that these independent lines of evidence converge on a common picture, requires someone to read across all 7 simultaneously. Academic career incentives reward depth in a specialty, not breadth across specialties. The synthesis gets done rarely, and when it is done, it appears in review papers that are read by other scientists, not in formats that reach general audiences at the necessary scale. The third cause is what researchers in science communication call the Cassandra problem. Scientists who communicate their findings at full urgency, without the standard softening and hedging, risk being characterized as alarmists. The accusation of alarmism is particularly damaging in scientific culture because it implies that emotion has overwhelmed rigorous analysis, which is the cardinal professional sin. Once a scientist is labelled an alarmist, their credibility is undermined in ways that affect not just public reception of their work, but career consequences within the scientific community itself. Paul Ehrlich has been making accurate structural arguments about biodiversity collapse for 5 decades, arguments that have been vindicated by subsequent data in every essential respect. Some of his specific predictions from the 1960s and 70s about the timing of specific collapses did not materialize on the schedules he projected. Those failed specific predictions, minor in the context of his overall body of work, have been weaponized repeatedly to dismiss the structural analysis that has proven correct. Other scientists, aware of this dynamic, modulate their public communication accordingly. The fourth cause is the economics and attention dynamics of science journalism. Science journalists, at their best, are translators working at the intersection of complex technical literature and general audiences. But the structural incentives of media production, regardless of whether it appears on YouTube, in newspapers, on podcasts or elsewhere, reward novelty and narrative clarity over sustained attention to slow-moving processes. An asteroid threat story has a clear protagonist, a clear timeline, and a clear dramatic arc. An insect population decline story requires sustained attention to trends measured over decades, an understanding of background extinction rates, and the willingness to follow cascade mechanisms through multiple ecological levels before the significance becomes apparent. The asteroid story gets the audience. The insect story gets the specialist audience. The result is episodic public attention. A dramatic paper is published, generates a brief burst of coverage and public discussion, then disappears from consciousness. The next paper, confirming and extending the first, generates another brief cycle. The accumulated weight of 7 converging lines of evidence is never quite present all at once in public awareness. It lives in the scientific literature, distributed across journals and disciplines, available to anyone patient enough to find and read it. but never assembled into the integrated picture that would make the convergence legible to the people it most concerns, which is everyone. There is a final dimension to this question that deserves honest engagement, because it touches on something more difficult than institutional failure or disciplinary fragmentation. Some scientists know more than they say publicly, not because of coordinated suppression, not because anyone has instructed them to be silent, but because of a fundamental asymmetry in human psychology, the difficulty of communicating conclusions that are frightening to the speaker as much as to the audience. Researchers who spend their professional lives studying extinction, who spend years in the field watching populations decline, who run models showing where current trajectories lead, are not somehow immune to the emotional weight of that knowledge. The professional norm of epistemic caution, which we've discussed as a structural incentive, also serves as a psychological buffer. It gives scientists a legitimate professional reason to say, the data shows X, and further research is needed to confirm Y, even when Y is the conclusion their own honest assessment of the totality of evidence most strongly supports. This is not dishonesty. Most scientists would describe it as professional responsibility, but the effect, for public understanding, is a persistent and systematic understatement of risk relative to what the evidence warrants. This is the gap, not a conspiracy, not suppression, a structural mismatch between the pace and tone of scientific communication and the pace and scale at which the biological world is changing. Let us step back now from the individual reasons and look at what they collectively describe, because the picture that emerges from them together is more important than any single one of them. Mass extinctions, as the geological record reveals them, are not primarily stories about sudden catastrophes. The Chicxulub impact was a sudden catastrophe, certainly, but it triggered a mass extinction rather than a severe but recoverable ecosystem disruption, partly because it hit a biosphere that was already under stress. Marine ecosystem diversity had been declining for hundreds of thousands of years in the late Cretaceous before the asteroid struck. The Deccan Traps volcanic province was already releasing significant CO2 and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere for at least 200,000 years before the impact. The asteroid did not cause a mass extinction in a vacuum. It caused one by delivering a catastrophic acute stress to a biosphere that had already depleted some of its resilience. This is the pattern that the 7 reasons together describe. Not an approaching asteroid, not a single imminent triggering event, but a progressive depletion of biological resilience across multiple independent systems simultaneously, producing precisely the kind of condition in which an acute stress, whatever its specific form, could push the biosphere across a threshold that a fully resilient biosphere could absorb. The systems that buffer biological resilience are the same ones we have been examining tonight. Insect populations, which perform the pollination and detritivary functions that allow plant communities to regenerate after disturbance. Freshwater ecosystems, which maintain the hydrological and nutritional connections between terrestrial and marine systems. Ocean chemistry, which governs marine plankton, which produce roughly half of Earth's atmospheric oxygen and fix enormous quantities of carbon. Functional diversity, which determines how many independent pathways exist for critical ecological processes to continue when individual species are lost. Each of the 7 reasons represents a different dimension of that buffer capacity being depleted. Not to zero, not yet, but measurably, across all 7 dimensions, simultaneously, in ways that are coherent with the patterns that precede mass extinction events in the geological record. The biosphere is not about to collapse, the way a building collapses when its foundation fails all at once. The process is more like a ship taking on water through 7 small breaches simultaneously, each individually manageable with the right response. Collectively, sufficient to threaten the vessel's integrity if they are not addressed and continue to widen. Before we close, we need to address the one dimension of this story that is simultaneously the most important and the most frequently lost in these discussions. Recovery is possible. The biosphere has survived all 5 previous mass extinctions. After the end Permian event, which killed 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates, in what some researchers estimate was as little as 60,000 years of acute crisis, the biosphere recovered its diversity. It took approximately 10 million years for taxonomic richness to return to pre-extinction levels. 10 million years is 4.5 times the length of time separating modern humans from the last common ancestor we share with chimpanzees. The recovery was real, but it was a recovery measured in geological time, on scales that are completely decoupled from any time scale relevant to human civilization. And it was a recovery to different life. Not the same species, not the same ecosystems, not the same biological architecture. The post-Permian world was populated by organisms that evolved from survivors, filling ecological roles the extinct organisms had held. The recovery was genuine, but the specific diversity that was lost was permanently gone. No Permian coral species ever returned. No trilobite ever swam in a post-Permian sea. The recovery of diversity does not mean the recovery of what was lost. It means the evolution of what replaced it. This matters because the public discourse around extinction risk sometimes implicitly frames the question as whether nature will survive. Nature will survive in the sense that life on Earth will persist for as long as the sun remains on the main sequence, another 5 billion years or so. The question is whether the specific biosphere we inhabit, the one that evolved over the last 66 million years of the Cenozoic era, the one that supports our agriculture, our fisheries, our clean water systems, our stable climate, will survive in a form compatible with the civilization we have built within it. The fossil record's evidence of recovery is not reassurance. It is context. It tells you what the long-term trajectory of life on Earth looks like after a mass extinction. And it tells you that nothing in that trajectory has any particular relevance to the 10,000-year history of human civilization, or to the civilization that might exist 1,000 years from now, which is the timescale within which the consequences of current decisions will be experienced. What we are working to protect when we talk about the 6th mass extinction is not life in the abstract. It is the irreplaceable biological architecture that has accumulated over 66 million years of Cenozoic evolution. Every food system, every ecosystem service, every pollinated crop, every breathulated atmosphere, every watershed, every fishery that human civilization depends upon is embedded in that architecture. Losing it does not mean the end of life. It means the end of the conditions under which our specific form of civilization is viable. The honest answer to the question posed by tonight's title, whether we are overdue for a mass extinction, is not a single yes or no. By the measure of the geological periodicity data, no. The 27.5 million year cycle places the next periodic pulse 11 to 16 million years away. We are not due in any astronomical sense. By the measure of the diagnostic precursor conditions visible in the fossil record before mass extinction thresholds are crossed, yes, we are already inside the warning interval. The biosphere is exhibiting, simultaneously and measurably, the kinds of stress signatures that appear in geological records before mass extinction events. Not all of them, not yet at the scale required by the geological definition, but enough of them progressing fast enough across enough independent biological systems that the description early stages of a mass extinction process is the conclusion that the evidence most straightforwardly supports. By the measure of the trajectory, if current trends continue for another century or two, yes. The peer-reviewed literature on current extinction rates, insect decline, ocean acidification, freshwater collapse, functional diversity loss, and climate tipping point risk converges on a picture in which the 75% species loss threshold is reachable within the next few centuries on current trajectories. A few centuries is not an eternity. It is within the time horizon of civilizations that build cathedrals and write legal codes and inherit the biological consequences of decisions made by their grandparents. And by the measure of opportunity, because this is the dimension the 7 reasons together most clearly illuminate, there is still time. The processes driving all 7 reasons are human-caused. They reflect specific decisions made in agriculture, energy production, land use, fisheries management, and international governance. Decisions that were made can be changed. Trajectories that are human-generated can be altered by human action. This is not optimism dressed as analysis. It is what the data shows. The extinction crisis is not a geological inevitability. It is a consequence of choices, which means it is responsive to different choices. The geological record has shown us 5 times what a world looks like after biological resilience is fully depleted. Each time, it showed us something unrecognizable, populated by organisms that evolved from survivors into an emptied world. Each time, it showed us that the recovery, when it came without memory, without continuity, without any of the specific biological history that preceded the collapse. The post-Permian world did not mourn the trilobites. It simply filled the space they left with something new. We are the first species in the history of life on Earth capable of reading those records, understanding what they mean, and consciously deciding whether to continue on the path that leads there. That is not a comfortable position to occupy, but it is precisely and only where we are. And knowing it exactly, without the layers of institutional caution and disciplinary fragmentation that have kept it from reaching the clarity it deserves, is the only starting point that has ever led anywhere worth going. Instead of trying to explore anything, leak chemistry, the light from extinction events past has been travelling toward us through the geological record for millions of years. We have now built instruments sensitive enough to read it. What we do with what we read is the question that the next century will answer, one way or another, for every species alive on Earth today. There is something that deserves careful attention here, something that most treatments of extinction risk skip past in their rush to arrive at either alarm or reassurance. The question of what we are actually losing, specifically when species disappear. Not in the abstract moral sense, but that conversation has value too. In the purely physical, material, irreversible sense. When the western black rhinoceros was declared extinct in 2011, having last been confirmed alive in 2006 in Cameroon, the loss was widely covered as a conservation tragedy. It was. But the coverage almost universally framed the loss in terms of the animal itself, its cultural significance, its physical grandeur, the emotional weight of a species that had existed for millions of years, vanishing in the space of a few decades of uncontrolled poaching. What the coverage rarely addressed was the functional role the western black rhinoceros played in the West African savanna ecosystems it inhabited. Large-bodied browsers shape vegetation structure. Their dung distributes nutrients and seeds. Their movement patterns create and maintain trails used by dozens of other species. Their absence is not a gap in the scenery. It is a functional change in the ecosystem, invisible to any tourist who visits those landscapes today, but registered in the altered vegetation, the altered soil chemistry, the altered behavioral patterns of the species that remain. The western black rhinoceros was one species. Its functional role in West African ecosystems was specific, irreplaceable, and gone. That dynamic, multiplied across the hundreds of species lost in the last century and the thousands at serious risk today, is what the seventh reason, the collapse of functional diversity, actually describes. It is not a number, it is a texture. A progressive loss of ecological complexity that does not announce itself loudly or all at once, but that accumulates in the background, reducing resilience, narrowing options, degrading the biological machinery that everything else depends upon. The restoration ecology literature, the body of science focused on how damaged ecosystems recover, gives us perhaps the clearest picture of what functional diversity loss actually means in practice. I asked DC, when ecologists attempt to restore degraded ecosystems, the limiting factor is almost never the physical substrate. Soils can be rebuilt, water can be returned to streams, native plants can be replanted. The limiting factor is almost always the absence of specific animals performing specific functions that the ecosystem requires to self-maintain. A restored coastal salt marsh without the appropriate invertebrates to process organic matter will not cycle nutrients correctly. A replanted tropical forest without the appropriate large-fruited trees and the large-bodied animals needed to disperse those trees' seeds will not regenerate its original canopy structure, even given centuries. The plants are available. The animals that enable the plants to maintain their ecological relationships with each other and with the soil are not. This is the irreversibility that makes functional diversity loss categorically different from other forms of environmental damage. You can clean up a chemical spill. You can regulate pollutants out of existence. You can let an overharvested fish population recover, given sufficient time and management. You cannot bring back the ecological functions performed by extinct species, because those functions were encoded in living organisms shaped by millions of years of evolutionary history with specific partners in specific environments. The genetic information is gone, the behavioral repertoire is gone, The ecological relationships are gone. What remains is an ecosystem that is simpler, more fragile, and less capable of self-repair than what preceded it. It is worth dwelling for a moment on one of the most fundamental misunderstandings about how extinction crises develop, because that misunderstanding shapes public perception of the current situation in ways that are actively counterproductive. The misunderstanding is this: that a mass extinction looks, from the inside, like a catastrophe, that it is recognizable in real time as something catastrophic, that organisms living through a mass extinction experience it the way we experience a hurricane, as something obviously severe, obviously unusual, obviously requiring urgent response. The fossil record says otherwise. The end Permian extinction, the most severe in Earth's history, unfolded over tens of thousands of years. Any individual organism alive at any specific moment during that event experienced a world that looked roughly like the world of its parents. Slightly warmer, perhaps, slightly more acidic in the ocean, slightly less diverse in some regions, but not obviously catastrophically, unmistakably different from the world that came before. The catastrophe was only visible from above, from the geological perspective that sees the full arc of change, from the pre-extinction world to the post-extinction world. From inside, it was a series of small changes, each individually survivable, collectively fatal. This is exactly the structure of the current situation. The vertebrate extinction rate is elevated by a factor of 53 to 114 above background. By any geological standard, that is dramatic, but it means that if you go outside today and look at the birds, the mammals, the reptiles and amphibians in your environment, almost certainly everything you see is still there. The ones that are gone are largely the ones you never had the opportunity to see. The ones that are declining are still present in numbers that may seem unremarkable unless you know what their populations looked like 50 years ago. The background of comparison against which we measure normal is itself degraded. We have forgotten what full ecological health looks like because no living human has ever seen it. Ecologists call this shifting baseline syndrome. The ocean as it appears today, with its depleted fisheries and degraded reefs, is the ocean that young marine biologists are trained against. It is their baseline. The ocean as it appeared to biologists in 1950, already itself depleted relative to 1900, is not experientially available to them. The ocean of 1900, before industrial trawling had systematically stripped the largest, most reproductively important fish from every accessible fishing ground, is accessible only in historical records and ecosystem models. Each generation of scientists inherits a new, lower baseline and calibrates its sense of what is normal, what is abundant, what is healthy, against that lower starting point. The baseline itself shifts downward, carrying with it the threshold of alarm. Daniel Pauly at the University of British Columbia, who identified shifting baseline syndrome in the context of fishery science in a landmark 1995 paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, argued that this cognitive phenomenon is among the most significant obstacles to effective conservation management. If scientists, who have access to historical data and explicit training in its use, systematically underweight the historical baseline, the problem is far more acute for the general public, whose baseline is set entirely by personal experience and is therefore limited to a single human lifetime. The first time you see a coral reef, you are seeing it as it is now, not as it was. If you are young enough that the first reef you saw was already bleached and impoverished relative to its state in 1980, your baseline for reef health is bleached and impoverished. Subsequent bleaching events are measured against that baseline, not against the vibrant, structurally complex reefs that existed before industrial fishing, before widespread coastal pollution, before the onset of ocean warming. The crisis is invisible because the baseline against which it would be visible has been lost from living memory. This dynamic operates at exactly the same scale as the mass extinction process itself. Both are slow enough to fall beneath the threshold of individual human perception of change. Both are fast enough, measured against geological baselines, to represent dramatic departures from the conditions under which the current biosphere evolved. The mismatch between human timescales and biological timescales is not incidental to the communication failure we have been examining. It is its deepest structural cause. The ocean dead zones we mentioned in the context of freshwater runoff deserve their own extended examination because they represent a phenomenon that is both one of the clearest indicators of biosphere stress and one of the most systematically underreported environmental stories of the past 50 years. 1. Medication. Oceanic dead zones, technically known as hypoxic zones, are regions of the ocean in which dissolved oxygen has been depleted to levels below which most marine life cannot survive, roughly below 2 milligrams of oxygen per litre. They form when excess nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural fertilizer and livestock waste runoff, enter coastal waters and trigger explosive growth of algae and phytoplankton. When those blooms die and sink, the bacteria that decompose them consume oxygen from the water column faster than it can be replenished from the surface. The result is a layer of oxygen-depleted water that sits on the bottom, where it kills or drives away everything that cannot escape quickly enough. Bottom-dwelling invertebrates, which cannot swim away, die in place. The dead zone is named for what it produces, a seafloor and water column stripped of animal life. The first modern scientific description of a large recurring dead zone was in the Baltic Sea, where hypoxic conditions had been worsening since at least the 1950s, driven by the intensification of European agriculture. By the 1970s, researchers were documenting similar phenomena in the Black Sea, the northern Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, and coastal areas off the coasts of China, Japan, and South Korea. The scientific monitoring of dead zones began in earnest in the 1980s and 1990s. But the current count, maintained by Robert Diaz at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and colleagues, stands at approximately 700 confirmed hypoxic zones worldwide, up from roughly 400 in 2008. The number has roughly doubled in each decade since systematic monitoring began. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, fed by nitrogen and phosphorus draining from the farms of the Mississippi River watershed, the agricultural heart of the most productive food system in human history, now covers an area that has grown from roughly 8,000 square kilometres in the 1980s to a peak of more than 22,000 square kilometres in recent years, with the size varying annually based on the volume of spring rainfall, which determines how much fertilizer runoff reaches the river. What makes dead zones an extinction risk indicator, rather than merely a localized ecological disturbance, is the cumulative footprint they represent and the feedback dynamics they create. A dead zone does not simply kill the organisms present when it forms. It removes that region of seafloor from biological productivity for as long as the hypoxic conditions persist, which in regions with stable, stratified water columns can be months or years. The benthic, meaning bottom-dwelling, communities that are eliminated represent decades of ecological succession. The slow accumulation of sediment-dwelling invertebrates, the microbial communities that process organic matter, the smaller organisms that feed on those microbes, the flatfish and invertebrates that feed on those organisms. Rebuilding that community after a hypoxic event requires years to decades, assuming the nutrient inputs that cause the dead zone are reduced. In regions where nutrient inputs are not reduced, the dead zone recurs annually, preventing the benthic community from ever re-establishing. The pattern of expanding dead zones is a direct measure of the rate at which human agriculture is outrunning the ocean's capacity to process the nutrient loads we are delivering to it. And it is a preview, at a smaller scale, of the oceanic oxygen dynamics that characterize some of the most severe intervals of the end Permian extinction, where deep ocean anoxia, the complete absence of oxygen in deep water, is recorded in the geological sediments as a global phenomenon accompanying the collapse of marine ecosystems. The sixth mass extinction, as a scientific concept, entered the public consciousness primarily through the work of two researchers whose careers represent two different approaches to communicating scientific urgency. Understanding both approaches, and why neither has fully succeeded, illuminates something important about the challenge we face. Richard Leakey, the paleoanthropologist and conservationist, was among the first to use the phrase sixth extinction in the title of a popular book, co-authored with science writer Roger Lewin in 1995. The book argued, drawing on then available extinction rate data, that the biosphere was experiencing a spasm of extinction comparable in scale to the 5 geological mass extinctions driven by human activity. The book was accessible, well written, and scientifically grounded. It sold respectably and received positive reviews. It did not change the trajectory of public policy on biodiversity conservation in any measurable way. Elizabeth Colbert, a journalist for The New Yorker, published a book titled The Sixth Extinction, An Unofficial History in 2014, nearly 2 decades after Leakey and Lewin, by which time the scientific evidence was substantially stronger. Colbert's book won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2015. It reached a large audience. It was read and discussed widely. It did not change the trajectory of public policy on biodiversity conservation in any measurable way. The problem is not the quality of the communication. Both books are good. The problem is structural. Books and articles about extinction risk reach an audience that is already motivated to read about science and environmental issues. They confirm and deepen concern among people who are already concerned. They do not reliably reach the audiences that make the decisions in agriculture, in energy, in urban planning, in international trade that determine extinction outcomes. And even when they do reach those audiences, understanding a problem and having the institutional capacity to act on it are different things. This is not an argument for fatalism. It is an argument for being precise about where the communication failure actually lies. It is not primarily in the quality of science writing. It is in the absence of institutional mechanisms that translate scientific understanding of risk into policy responses proportionate to the risk. We have such mechanisms for some categories of risk: financial systemic risk, pandemic preparedness, to a degree, certain categories of nuclear risk, we do not have them for biodiversity collapse. The International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, was created in 2012, partly to provide biodiversity the kind of authoritative international scientific assessment that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, provides for climate. Its 2019 Global Assessment Report, the most comprehensive review of global biodiversity status ever conducted, found that approximately 1 million animal and plant species are currently threatened with extinction. The report was covered briefly in international media when it was released. Then, the news cycle moved on. The 1 million threatened species figure did not become a fixture of public discourse the way that carbon parts per million concentrations have. The mechanisms for translating that assessment into policy action remain largely unbuilt. We should also address, directly and without excessive hedging, the possibility that is most uncomfortable to consider, that the current extinction crisis crosses the mass extinction threshold, regardless of what human civilization does in the next century. This possibility is not the central scientific position. The central scientific position, expressed in the work of Barnowski, Ceballos, and others, is that the current trajectory leads to mass extinction conditions if current trends continue, but that current trends are not immutable. 1. They are driven by human choices that can be changed. This is the mainstream scientific view, and it is the view with the most direct evidentiary support. But it is not the only view held by serious researchers. Some ecologists who work in the most depleted ecosystems, who track species year after year and watch populations decline toward viability thresholds, hold a darker private assessment that certain ecological processes, once set in motion, develop momentum that cannot be reversed on the timescales available. That the freshwater ecosystems of Southeast Asia, the most biodiverse freshwater region on Earth by a wide margin and among the most heavily degraded, may already be past recoverable thresholds for many of their endemic species. That the coral reef ecosystems of the Indo-Pacific, which contain roughly 30% of all described marine fish species, despite covering less than 1% of ocean floor, may be functionally gone as structurally complex, three-dimensional habitats within 50 to 100 years, regardless of emissions trajectories. 2. Because the warming already committed by existing atmospheric CO2 concentrations will drive bleaching events of increasing frequency and severity, regardless of what happens to emissions from this point forward. These are not the positions these researchers publish. They publish the positions that the data can most rigorously support. But they are the positions that emerge in conversations among researchers who have spent decades watching specific systems deteriorate, and they reflect an honest private assessment that the public communication, shaped by the incentives we have discussed, does not fully convey. The reason to include this here, without endorsing it as the established scientific consensus, is that the gap between what researchers know and what they say is itself part of the story. The 7 reasons we have examined tonight represent the scientific data. The full picture includes the human beings who study that data, the institutional pressures that shape how they communicate it, and the private assessments that those pressures imperfectly contain. There is one more dimension of the extinction story that belongs in this conversation, one that connects the 7 scientific reasons to the broader question of what extinction actually means for the future of life on Earth, and specifically for the future of human civilization. Human civilization is not separate from the biosphere, it is embedded in it. Every calorie of food consumed by every human being on Earth comes ultimately from photosynthesis, performed by plants and algae that depend on soil microbiomes maintained by invertebrates and fungi, pollinated by insects, grown in climates regulated by forests and oceans, irrigated with water, filtered through watersheds maintained by intact vegetation. The food system, the most fundamental infrastructure of human civilization, is a biological system that depends at every level on the biological systems we have been discussing tonight. Every antibiotic in the pharmacological repertoire of modern medicine was either derived from soil microorganisms or developed by studying their chemical defense mechanisms. The pharmaceutical industry did not develop these compounds from scratch. It discovered them in the chemical innovations of millions of years of biological evolution, present in the species diversity of microbial ecosystems that are themselves under pressure from agricultural chemicals, land conversion, and climate disruption. The material from which the strongest and lightest structural fibers ever produced by human engineering were derived, spider silk, has still not been replicated artificially at industrial scale, despite decades of effort. The structural principles underlying bone, which combines hardness and flexibility in a ratio that no engineered material has matched, were discovered by studying biological systems. The computation efficiency of neural networks, which underpins modern artificial intelligence, was inspired by the architecture of biological nervous systems. The biological world is not a luxury that human civilization can afford to lose without consequence. It is the foundational library from which human technological civilization has been borrowing, largely without acknowledgement, for its entire history. The loss of that library is irreversible in any timescale that matters to any conceivable future civilization. The genetic information encoded in the species going extinct today represents billions of years of evolutionary experimentation, of chemical and structural and behavioral solutions to the challenges of survival in Earth's environments. It does not exist anywhere else. It is not backed up. When it is gone, it is gone, in the way that the burned scrolls of Alexandria were gone, except that the Library of Alexandria contained knowledge that humans had produced and could in principle reproduce. The genetic library of the biosphere contains knowledge that 4 billion years of evolution produced, and that cannot be reproduced on any timescale relevant to any feature we can meaningfully imagine. The geological record has shown us 5 times what the world looks like after that library has had 3/4 of its volumes destroyed in a geological instant. It showed us an impoverished world, a simpler world, a world that eventually rebuilt its complexity over 10 million years into something new, not something restored, something new, growing from what survived. We are the first species in the history of life on Earth that can read those records clearly enough to understand what they mean, and that possesses the cognitive and technological capacity to choose, consciously and deliberately, a different outcome. That capacity has existed for perhaps the last 50 years, which is to say for roughly the last 0.003% of the time life has existed on Earth. We have not yet chosen the different outcome. We have been choosing, through the aggregate of individual and institutional decisions about land use, energy, agriculture, fisheries, and international governments, the continuation of the trajectory the 7 reasons describe. Not maliciously, not through ignorance in most cases, through the operation of economic incentives that externalize biological costs, through institutional structures that optimize for short-term returns and discount long-term consequences, through the communication failures we have examined, and through the simple human difficulty of maintaining urgent attention to processes that unfold slowly enough to fall beneath the threshold of immediate perception. The 7 reasons scientists think we may be overdue for a mass extinction are not primarily about asteroids or volcanic eruptions or the indifferent mechanics of a universe that does not care whether any particular biological experiment persists. They are about a set of choices made over a few hundred years by a single species with extraordinary technological capability and, until very recently, limited ecological self-awareness. Choices that can be made differently. Not without cost, not without disruption, not without the kind of institutional and economic transformation that has no precedent in human history. But, differently, the light from past extinctions has been travelling toward us through the geological record for hundreds of millions of years. We have finally built the instruments to read it. The question is not whether we understand what it says. The evidence presented tonight suggests we understand it quite well, or at least that the people who have spent their careers reading it understand it quite well. The question is whether that understanding, assembled from 7 independent scientific disciplines, converging on a picture that the geological record has shown us before, reaches the clarity and public consciousness that its urgency requires. Not the false clarity of alarm that paralyzes, and not the false comfort of certainty that the problem is manageable. The honest clarity of a situation that is both genuinely serious and genuinely responsive to human action, if that action comes with the urgency and scale that the evidence warrants. That is the question the next few decades will answer, in the living world around us, one species at a time. There is a practical question that emerges from everything discussed tonight, and it deserves a direct answer, even though this video was not designed to provide prescriptions. The question is, what does the evidence actually require of us, in specific terms, not in the language of generalized concern? The answer from the science is more concrete than most public discourse suggest. The largest single driver of species extinction globally is habitat loss, primarily through the conversion of natural land to agricultural use. A 2019 analysis by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization found that agriculture is the leading cause of habitat loss for 86% of threatened species documented in the IUCN Red List. Not climate change, not pollution, not invasive species, though all of those are significant. Agriculture, the expansion of the human food system into natural habitats, is the primary engine of the extinction crisis. This does not mean that solving the extinction crisis requires everyone to stop eating. It means that the way food is produced, and specifically the ratio between the land area used for food production and the quantity of food produced from that area, is the central variable. Land sparing, the concept of producing food more intensively on land already under cultivation to reduce the need to convert additional natural habitat, versus land sharing, maintaining lower intensity agriculture interspersed with natural habitat, is one of the most actively debated questions in conservation science, with researchers including Ben Phelan at the University of Cambridge, Jörn Fischer at Leuphana University, and many others taking nuanced positions that resist the simple version of the debate. What is not debated is the direction of the required change. The current global food system is on an expansion trajectory, driven by growing human population and per capita food demand that is incompatible with stabilizing the biosphere at anything close to its current biodiversity. The conservation biology literature is clear on this. The question is not whether the food system needs to change. It is which specific changes produce the best outcomes across the interacting criteria of food security, ecological stability, and social equity. The second most significant driver, closely intertwined with the first, is climate change. The detailed mechanisms by which climate change affects species vary by taxon and ecosystem type, but the overall pattern across the literature is consistent. Species ranges shift as temperatures change. Species adapted to specific temperature ranges face increasing thermal stress. Seasonal timing mismatches develop between species whose life cycles were called a common melon made by peak, dark, and extreme weather events become more frequent and severe, disrupting ecological processes that evolved in the context of historical climate variability. A 2019 study by Warren and colleagues in Science estimated that at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial temperatures, roughly 6% of insects, 8% of plants, and 4% of vertebrates would lose more than half their currently suitable climate range. At 2 degrees, those figures rise to 18% of insects, 16% of plants, and 8% of vertebrates. At 3.2 degrees, the trajectory implied by current emissions pledges from major economies, 49% of insects, 44% of plants, and 26% of vertebrates. These figures are not predictions of extinction. They are predictions of range loss, which is a precondition for extinction, rather than extinction itself. Species that lose suitable climate range do not immediately go extinct, but they become smaller in population, more fragmented, more vulnerable to the stochastic events, disease, extreme weather, inbreeding, that push small populations toward extinction. What range loss data tells you that at 3.2 degrees of warming, nearly half of all insects will be living in smaller, more fragmented, more stressed ranges by 2010. That is the condition of a biosphere with severely depleted resilience, primed for the kinds of cascading losses that the fossil record associates with mass extinction events. The third driver, often overlooked in discussions focused on climate and habitat, is what conservation biologists call overexploitation, the direct killing of species at rates exceeding their reproductive capacity through hunting, fishing, and collection for trade. Overfishing has reduced the biomass of large predatory fish in the oceans by an estimated 90% from pre-industrial baselines, according to a landmark 2003 paper by Ransom Myers and Boris Worm in Nature. Not a decline, not a reduction, an elimination of 90% of the large predatory fish that existed in the pre-industrial ocean, including the tuna, swordfish, sharks, cod, and marlin that structured marine food webs across every ocean basin. 90% in roughly 50 years of industrialized fishing. The oceans did not visibly change in a way that registered with most of the people living around them, because the change happened gradually over decades, and because the fishing industry's economics adjusted to target progressively smaller, lower trophic level species as the large ones were depleted. The ocean looks productive, the fish markets are still full, but the composition has shifted dramatically from an ocean dominated by large, long-lived, reproductively conservative apex predators to one dominated by smaller, shorter-lived, more reproductively prolific species lower in the food chain. The productivity is real, but the ecological architecture is fundamentally altered, and the large predators that held the previous architecture together are, in most ocean regions, functionally gone. The illegal wildlife trade, which the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates generates between $7 and $23 billion annually, is the fourth largest illegal trade globally after drugs, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. It is driving multiple species toward extinction that are not significantly threatened by habitat loss or climate change through the direct, targeted removal of individuals for exotic pet markets, traditional medicine, luxury goods, and trophy collections. The pangolin, the most trafficked wild mammal in the world, according to Traffic, the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network, is being removed from Asian and African ecosystems at a rate that has placed all 8 species in the genus on the IUCN Red List as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. What all of these drivers share is that they are not natural. They are not geological processes operating on timescales beyond human influence. They are economic activities driven by market incentives, governed by policy choices, and therefore changeable by policy decisions, economic restructuring, and shifts in consumer behavior. The extinction crisis is an economic crisis, in the sense that it is produced by a global economy that has been designed to efficiently extract biological resources without adequately pricing the cost of their depletion. Changing that economy is not simple, not fast, and not free, but it is within the category of things that human institutions are, in principle, capable of doing. One final scientific concept belongs in this discussion because it captures the specific danger of the current moment in a way that no individual piece of extinction data conveys on its own. The concept is called the extinction debt. An extinction debt is the number of species that are currently committed to extinction, meaning they will go extinct in the future even if all the immediate pressures driving extinction were eliminated today, because of conditions that already exist. The primary mechanism is habitat fragmentation. When a continuous natural habitat is broken into isolated fragments by roads, agricultural fields, or urban development, each fragment can initially support the same species that were present before fragmentation. But small, isolated habitat fragments cannot support viable populations of all species over the long term. Species that require large home ranges, species that require multiple habitat types that are no longer connected, species whose populations in the fragment are too small to maintain genetic diversity over generations. These species are living in a habitat that can no longer sustain them long term. They are still alive. They are functionally committed to extinction. The time lag between the creation of the habitat fragment and the eventual disappearance of the species living in it can be decades to centuries. This is called the extinction debt, and it represents a future extinction toll that is, in a meaningful sense, already accrued, already in the biological accounts, waiting to be paid out, regardless of what happens to the habitat from this point forward. A 2012 study by Veland and colleagues, published in PLOS ONE, attempted to quantify the extinction debt for plant species in fragmented habitats in Europe, using long-term vegetation survey data from 96 sites. They estimated that between 35 and 56% of the regional plant species pool represents committed future extinction. Species present in the current flora that will disappear as their fragmented habitat patches lose the capacity to maintain viable populations over the coming centuries. Between a third and a half of regional plant diversity in Europe committed to extinction by habitat fragmentation that is already in place. If a comparable extinction debt applies to the broader patterns of habitat loss and fragmentation documented globally, then the true scope of the coming extinction crisis is substantially larger than what current population trend data reveals. We are looking at the current biosphere and seeing species that still exist, populations that are still present, diversity that is still countable. We are not seeing, because it is not yet visible in the census data, the extinction debt, the species that are committed to disappear over the coming decades and centuries, banked against the habitat conditions that already exist, waiting to be paid out as the populations maintained in insufficient habitat slowly decline below viability thresholds. This is the full picture that the 7 reasons taken together describe. Not simply the extinction rate we can already measure, the extinction debt we have already incurred, the functional diversity losses already in progress, the tipping point dynamics already in motion, the acidification already committed by atmospheric CO2, already emitted, the insect decline already cascading through terrestrial food webs, the freshwater collapse already advanced beyond what most people are aware of. The question posed by the title of this video, whether we are overdue for a mass extinction, has a simpler and more direct answer than the full complexity of the science requires. We are in one. The debate in the scientific literature is not whether the current extinction episode meets the threshold for a mass extinction. It is whether we will allow it to complete itself to the geological 75% threshold, or whether we will recognize what is happening while there is still time to change the trajectory. That is the choice the 7 reasons describe. Not a future choice that will be made by people not yet born, in circumstances we cannot predict. A present choice being made now in the agricultural fields and fishing fleets and energy systems and policy chambers of a civilization that has, for the first time in the history of life on Earth, the awareness and the capability to see what it is doing to the biological world it inhabits. Whether it will use that awareness on the time scale that the biology requires is the question on which everything else depends. Not just for the species we are in the process of losing, for the species we are and for everything our civilization depends upon in the living world around it. That is where the evidence leads. Exactly, honestly, and without flinching.